The morning sun poured through the stained glass windows of the Sistine Chapel, casting colorful patterns across the marble floor. Vatican City buzzed with an energy that went beyond the usual tourist excitement. Workers rushed about carrying equipment and setting up chairs, while security personnel spoke urgently into their earpieces. This wasn't just another day at the heart of Catholicism. It was the day before what many were calling the musical event of the year. In his private study, Pope Leo XIV sat at his desk, his fingers drumming lightly on the polished wood. At 68, he carried himself with the dignity his position demanded, but those who knew him well recognized the slight bounce in his movements today, a sign of his genuine excitement. Unlike many of his predecessors who viewed the arts with cautious distance, Leo had embraced culture as a bridge between the church and the modern world. "Your Holiness," called a gentle voice from the doorway. Cardinal Rossi, the Pope's longtime friend and advisor, stood with a folder in his hands. "The final program for tomorrow's concert, and Maestro Ricci's team has sent over some additional technical requirements." The Pope smiled, taking the folder. "Let me guess, more specific lighting? Or perhaps another adjustment to the piano position?" The Cardinal chuckled. "Both, actually, and he's requested that the choir stand further back during his solo pieces. Musicians and their particulars," Pope Leo said with a warm smile, no judgment in his voice. "We shall accommodate where we can. This concert means too much to let small details derail it." And indeed it did. The charity concert had been the Pope's personal project for nearly a year, a bold initiative to raise funds for refugee children displaced by conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, by bringing together sacred and classical music performed by the Vatican's own choir and one of the world's most celebrated pianists. Leo hoped to showcase how art could transcend religious and cultural boundaries. Matteo Ricci was not an easy catch. The pianist rarely performed at religious venues, preferring the grand concert halls of Vienna, New York, and Tokyo. His technical brilliance was matched only by his intensity and his reputation for being difficult. Stories of Ricci storming out of rehearsals or publicly criticizing orchestras had become almost as famous as his playing, but his talent was undeniable, and when performing, he seemed touched by something divine, a quality that had not escaped the Pope's notice. It had taken months of careful negotiation, a substantial donation to Ricci's own arts foundation, and finally, a personal letter from the Pope himself to secure the pianist's participation. The letter, those close to the situation whispered, had been the turning point. Leo had written not as the head of the Catholic Church but as a fellow lover of music, describing how Ricci's recording of Bach's Goldberg variations had moved him to tears during a particularly difficult week early in his papacy. Across the Vatican, in the main rehearsal space, Sister Elena tapped her baton against her music stand, bringing the 40 members of the papal choir to attention. At 52, she had directed the choir for 15 years, transforming it from a good traditional choir to an exceptional one capable of tackling complex contemporary pieces alongside ancient Gregorian chants. "From the beginning of the Mozart, please. And remember what we discussed about the dynamics. This needs to breathe more in the middle section." The choir nodded, understanding the challenge. They would be performing with Ricci for only parts of the concert, but those sections needed to be flawless. The pianist's reputation for perfectionism hung over them like a storm cloud. Sister Elena called out a young tenor named Paolo. "Is it true that Maestro Ricci once made a violinist cry during a chamber music festival in Salzburg?" Elena shot him a look that silenced the scattered laughter. "We are not concerned with gossip. We are concerned with being prepared. Now from the beginning." As the choir began the delicate opening lines of Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus, Sister Elena allowed herself a small, private moment of worry. The choir was ready. They had never sounded better, but Ricci was an unknown element. His few communications had been polite but distant, and he had declined all offers to rehearse with the choir before arriving at the Vatican. He would land in Rome that evening, with only tomorrow morning's rehearsal before the evening performance. The Pope, meanwhile, had moved from his study to the concert venue itself, the Paul VI Audience Hall, which had been transformed for the occasion. The modern hall, usually used for papal audiences and ceremonies, now featured sophisticated lighting, perfect acoustics thanks to temporary modifications, and seating for 2,000 guests, including diplomats, celebrities, and major donors to the church's humanitarian causes. "The piano arrives within the hour," said Father Thomas, the young American priest who had been appointed as the event coordinator. His previous life working in theater production before joining the priesthood had made him the perfect choice. "Ricci's technician will tune it immediately and then again tomorrow before the rehearsal." "And the live stream preparations?" the Pope asked, looking at the discrete cameras being installed around the hall. "All set, Your Holiness. We estimate a potential global audience of millions. The major networks in Europe and the Americas will carry portions live, and we have arrangements with streaming platforms to reach younger viewers." Leo nodded with satisfaction. This was exactly what he had envisioned, using modern technology to spread a message of hope and compassion. The substantial ticket prices for in-person attendance, combined with donation prompts during the live stream, were projected to raise enough money to build schools and medical facilities in 3 refugee camps. "Your Holiness," said a voice from behind. It was Cardinal Rossi again, this time with a concerned expression. "There's been a slight situation with Maestro Ricci's arrival." The Pope's eyebrows rose. "Oh?" "His flight landed early and he's already checked into his hotel. He's requesting to see the piano tonight rather than tomorrow morning." Leo considered this for a moment. It wasn't in the schedule, and the technical team was still setting up the sound system. But he understood musicians and their instruments. The relationship was intimate, almost sacred in its own way. "Let him come," the Pope decided. "Have Father Thomas meet him and ensure he has what he needs. And please extend an invitation for him to join me for breakfast tomorrow before the rehearsal." Cardinal Rossi looked relieved. "Very wise, Your Holiness. I'll arrange it immediately." As the Cardinal hurried away, Leo walked slowly around the empty hall, imagining it filled with people the next night. In his mind, he could already hear the music, the ancient sacred pieces blending with classical masterworks, all in service of helping those in desperate need. "It will be beautiful," he said quietly to himself. Later that evening, as darkness fell over the Vatican, Matteo Ricci stood alone on the stage of the Paul VI Hall. At 45, he cut an imposing figure, tall and lean with intense eyes that seemed to see through people rather than at them. His hands, those famous hands that commanded millions of notes with precision and emotion, ran lightly over the polished surface of the grand piano. Father Thomas watched nervously from the side of the stage. The pianist had barely acknowledged him upon arrival, merely nodding curtly before making a beeline for the instrument. For 20 minutes now, Ricci had been playing fragments, a bit of Bach here, a flash of Chopin there, testing the piano's response and the hall's acoustics. Finally, Ricci looked up. "The action is acceptable," he said, his first full sentence since arriving. "The acoustics need work. Too much reverb on the lower registers." Father Thomas swallowed. "The technicians can adjust the—" "See that they do," Ricci interrupted. "And the lighting needs to be softer when I perform alone. No harsh spots, they create shadows on the keyboard." "Of course, Maestro. We want everything to be perfect for you and for the cause." At the mention of the cause, something flickered across Ricci's face. A moment of softening, perhaps. "The refugee children, yes." He closed the piano lid gently. "His Holiness is passionate about this project." "Very much so," Father Thomas replied, sensing an opportunity to connect. He personally selected the music for the choir portions. "He's quite knowledgeable." Ricci made a non-committal sound. "We shall see. I understand he wishes to meet before rehearsal tomorrow?" "Yes, for breakfast. He's looking forward to discussing the program with you." The pianist nodded once. "I'll be here at 7:30. Please ensure the piano technician is available immediately after breakfast. I'll need at least an hour with the instrument before the choir joins." With that, he gathered his coat and walked briskly toward the exit, leaving Father Thomas both relieved and anxious about what the next day would bring. Back in his quarters, Pope Leo XIII knelt in prayer before retiring for the night. His prayers, as always, included petitions for those suffering around the world. Tonight he added something specific, a prayer for harmony, in music and in purpose for the concert ahead. Little did he know that within 24 hours, his composure, his knowledge, and his very dignity would be tested in ways he could not imagine, all because of a misunderstanding about Bach's intended tempos and a pianist whose passion sometimes overwhelmed his tact. As Vatican City slept, the stage was literally and figuratively set for what would become one of the most talked about moments in recent church history, a moment that would begin with humiliation but end with something far more profound. The morning of the concert arrived with a gentle rain that washed the Vatican's ancient stones clean. By 7 o'clock, the soft patter had stopped, leaving behind that special freshness that only follows rain. Inside the papal apartments, Pope Leo XIV sat at a small table by the window, watching as early morning light touched the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. "Your Holiness," his personal secretary announced from the doorway, "everything is prepared for your breakfast with Maestro Ricci." The Pope nodded, touching his napkin to his lips. "And he is on his way?" "He arrived 5 minutes ago. Cardinal Rossi is showing him to the garden room now." Leo took a moment to center himself. He had been looking forward to this meeting, this chance to speak musician to musician before the formalities of the day took over. Rising from his chair, he straightened his white cassock and made his way through the corridor to the small garden room where he often hosted intimate gatherings. Matteo Ricci stood when the Pope entered, bowing slightly. Up close, the pianist looked both younger and older than his photographs, his face unlined but his eyes carrying the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime in pursuit of perfection. "Maestro Ricci," the Pope said warmly, extending his hand. "What a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Your recordings have given me many hours of solace." Ricci shook the offered hand, his grip firm but brief. "The honor is mine, Your Holiness. I must admit I was surprised by your invitation to perform here." They sat at the table set with fresh fruit, pastries, and coffee. Leo noticed how Ricci's eyes constantly scanned the room, taking in details, assessing. It was the look of someone who missed nothing. "I understand musicians often have rituals before performances," the Pope said, pouring coffee for them both. "I hope this breakfast doesn't disrupt your routine." A tight smile crossed the pianist's face. "I've learned to adapt to unusual circumstances, though I typically spend the morning of a performance in complete silence." "Ah," Leo said, a hint of concern crossing his features. "Then perhaps we should keep this brief. I mainly wish to thank you personally for lending your talent to this cause." The conversation began to flow more easily as they discussed the program for the evening. Leo revealed his deep knowledge of classical music, speaking about Bach's mathematical precision and the emotional depths of Beethoven's later works. Ricci, initially reserved, gradually engaged more fully, his passion for music overcoming his natural standoffishness. "You surprise me," the pianist admitted after 30 minutes of animated discussion. Few people outside professional circles understand the structural complexity of Bach's counterpoint. Leo smiled. "The Church has a long history with music, Maestro, though I must confess my interest goes beyond the liturgical. In another life, perhaps." Ricci studied him curiously. "You might have been a musician?" "A music scholar at most. My hands lack your gift." The Pope glanced at his watch. "But now I believe the piano technician awaits you, and I have morning duties to attend to." They parted with greater warmth than they had met, Ricci promising to see the Pope briefly before the evening's performance. As Cardinal Rossi escorted the pianist to the concert hall, he noted with relief that the meeting seemed to have gone well. "His Holiness is quite knowledgeable about music," Rossi commented. Ricci nodded absently, his mind already shifting to the rehearsal ahead. "He speaks well enough of theory. Practice is another matter entirely." The rehearsal was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock. By 9:30, the Vatican choir had assembled on stage, warming up their voices under Sister Elena's watchful eye. Father Thomas darted about, checking last-minute details with the lighting and sound technicians. "He's been with the piano for almost an hour," Father Thomas whispered to Sister Elena. "Hasn't said a word to anyone except to ask for the bench to be adjusted twice." Elena sighed. "Let him have his space. Artists of his caliber often have particular ways." At precisely 10 o'clock, Ricci looked up from the piano and nodded curtly, indicating he was ready to begin. Sister Elena stepped forward. "Good morning, Maestro. We are honored to work with you. Perhaps we should start with the Mozart piece where the choir joins you after your solo introduction." Ricci considered this, then shook his head. "No, let's begin with the Bach. I need to hear how the choir handles the counterpoint." For the next hour, the rehearsal proceeded professionally but tensely. Ricci stopped frequently, sometimes mid-phrase, to correct what he perceived as flaws in the choir's interpretation. Sister Elena, though internally bristling at his manner, maintained her composure, translating his sometimes harsh criticisms into constructive guidance for her singers. "The tenors are dragging," Ricci called out after stopping abruptly during a complex passage. "And the sopranos are pushing sharp on the high notes." Sister Elena nodded. "Let's try again, everyone. Watch my hands carefully for the tempo." By the third hour of rehearsal, everyone was feeling the strain. The choir members exchanged weary glances as Ricci demanded a seventh run-through of a particularly challenging section. Father Thomas noticed several Vatican officials and staff members had slipped into the back of the hall to watch the famous pianist work, and then it happened. They had moved on to the piece that would close the first half of the program, a Bach chorale that the Pope had specifically requested. As the choir began, Ricci listened with increasing agitation, his fingers tapping impatiently on the piano lid. "Stop! Stop!" he called out, waving his hands. "This is all wrong. The tempo is glacial." Sister Elena kept her voice level. "We're following the marking His Holiness suggested. He feels this piece calls for a more contemplative approach." Something flashed in Ricci's eyes, a spark that those who knew him well would have recognized as dangerous. He stood abruptly from the piano bench. "His Holiness suggested?" The pianist's voice carried throughout the hall. "With all due respect to the Pope, Bach did not write this piece to be dragged along like a funeral dirge. This tempo completely destroys the mathematical precision of the counterpoint." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Father Thomas stepped forward, trying to diffuse the situation. "Perhaps we could try it both ways and decide." "There is nothing to decide," Ricci cut him off. "This is not a matter of opinion. This is a matter of musical fact." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I was told the Pope had musical knowledge, but this suggestion betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of Baroque composition." Sister Elena's face had gone pale. "Maestro Ricci, I'm sure we can—" "The Pope may be infallible in matters of faith," Ricci continued, his voice rising, seemingly unaware of the growing discomfort around him. "But in matters of Bach's intentions, he is woefully mistaken. This tempo makes a mockery of the composition. It's as if he's never properly studied the mathematical structure underlying Bach's work." A small gasp from someone in the choir broke the stunned silence. Father Thomas looked horrified. Several people in the back of the hall were quickly leaving, presumably to report what was happening. What none of them had noticed was a young assistant holding up a phone, recording the outburst for what he thought would be an exciting behind-the-scenes clip to show his friends. Ricci, suddenly aware of the effect his words had caused, took a deep breath. His expression shifted from anger to a controlled neutrality. "We will take a 30-minute break. When we return, we will perform this piece at the proper tempo." As he strode off the stage, silence hung in the air for several long seconds before an explosion of whispered conversations erupted among the choir members. Sister Elena turned to Father Thomas, her expression grave. "This is a disaster." The young priest nodded. "I should inform Cardinal Rossi immediately." "And the Pope?" Father Thomas looked pained. "I believe he will hear about this very soon, whether we tell him or not." Indeed, by lunchtime, Pope Leo XIV had been informed of the incident. He received the news calmly, sitting behind his desk, hands folded in front of him. "I see," he said simply when Cardinal Rossi finished his account. "And Maestro Ricci? He has continued the rehearsal after the break. More professionally, I'm told." The Pope was quiet for a moment. "The concert will proceed as planned. Please ensure everyone understands that." "But Your Holiness," his comments were disrespectful, and Leo raised a hand, stopping the Cardinal mid-sentence. "This event is not about me or about Maestro Ricci's opinions of my musical knowledge. It is about the children we are trying to help. Of course, but no buts, my friend. We will continue as planned." What neither the Pope nor anyone at the Vatican yet knew was that the video of Ricci's outburst had already been uploaded to social media by the young assistant. Within hours, it would spread across the internet, accompanied by headlines like "Famous Pianist Belittles Pope's Musical Knowledge" and "Vatican Concert Drama. Ricci claims Pope doesn't understand Bach." By evening, as guests began arriving for the concert, the video had been viewed millions of times. Journalists who had come to cover a charity event now buzzed with questions about the apparent conflict between the pianist and the pontiff. Inside his dressing room, Matteo Ricci sat alone, staring at his phone in horror as he scrolled through the breaking news stories. Only now did he fully comprehend the magnitude of his error. Not just a disagreement over musical interpretation, but a public criticism of one of the world's most beloved religious leaders, captured on video and shared with the world. A knock came at his door. 15 minutes until curtain, maestro, called a voice. Ricci put down his phone and looked at himself in the mirror. His face was pale, his eyes troubled. The perfectionism that had driven him to greatness had now led him to a very public mistake. He wondered if the Pope would cancel his performance, if the evening would end in further embarrassment. Another knock, more urgent this time. 10 minutes, maestro. His Holiness has requested to see you briefly before the performance. Ricci closed his eyes. What could he possibly say now? Matteo Ricci straightened his bow tie one last time before opening the door of his dressing room. Outside stood Cardinal Rossi, his usually warm face now carefully neutral. This way, maestro, the cardinal said, gesturing down the corridor. As they walked in silence, Ricci could hear the growing murmur of the audience filling the hall. 2,000 people, diplomats, celebrities, church officials, and wealthy donors, all there to witness what had now become something more complicated than a charity concert. I assume His Holiness has seen the video, Ricci said quietly. Cardinal Rossi gave a small nod. He has. I never intended for my professional critique to become public. The cardinal stopped walking and turned to face the pianist. Intentions rarely matter as much as actions, maestro, especially in the age of smartphones. They arrived at a small antechamber near the stage entrance. The Pope stood by a window looking out at the night sky. He turned as they entered, his face betraying nothing of his thoughts. Your Holiness, Ricci began, the words catching in his throat. I wish to express my sincere. Pope Leo raised a hand gently, stopping him mid-sentence. We have a concert to perform, maestro. 2,000 people are waiting, and millions more watching online. They are here for the music and for the children we hope to help. Ricci blinked, surprised by the lack of rebuke. Yes, of course. The program remains as planned, the Pope continued, including the Bach chorale at your preferred tempo. A flicker of confusion crossed the pianist's face. Thank you, Your Holiness. Leo's eyes met Ricci's directly. Music should never be a source of discord, maestro. Now shall we give our audience what they came for? With that, the Pope turned and walked toward the door that would lead him to his seat in the front row. Cardinal Rossi followed, leaving Ricci alone with his thoughts. 5 minutes later, Father Thomas appeared. It's time, maestro. Ricci nodded and followed him toward the stage. As they walked, the young priest couldn't help asking, What did His Holiness say to you? Almost nothing, Ricci replied, his brow furrowed. That's what troubles me most. The concert began with a piece performed solely by the Vatican choir. From his position waiting in the wings, Ricci watched as the audience sat enraptured by the perfect harmony of the voices. Sister Elena conducted with graceful precision, her earlier tension nowhere to be seen. In the front row, Pope Leo sat with perfect posture, his eyes closed at times, a small smile playing on his lips as the music washed over him. Cameras occasionally panned to his face, projecting his image onto the discrete screens positioned around the hall for those seated farther back. Then it was Ricci's turn. As he walked onto the stage, the applause was polite, but perhaps a touch cooler than he was accustomed to receiving. News of the morning's incident had clearly spread among the attendees. Seating himself at the piano, Ricci took a moment to center himself. Then his fingers touched the keys and everything else fell away. He began with Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, the opening chords resonating through the hall with dramatic intensity. For 20 minutes, he played without pause, moving from Beethoven to Chopin with fluid grace. The audience sat spellbound. Whatever they might think of the man, there was no denying his genius when he played. Even those who had arrived predisposed to judge him found themselves drawn into the pure emotion of his performance. From his seat, Pope Leo watched intently. Those close enough could see his fingers occasionally moving slightly in his lap, following the more complex passages. If he harbored any resentment toward the man who had publicly questioned his musical understanding, it was invisible on his face. After Ricci's solo section came the collaborative pieces with the choir. As the singers filed onto the risers behind the piano, a subtle tension returned to the room. How would the pianist and choir work together after the morning's confrontation? The first notes answered that question. Ricci began the introduction to Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus with delicate restraint, creating a perfect foundation for the choir's entrance. Sister Elena's eyes widened slightly in appreciation as she realized the pianist was taking special care to balance his playing with the voices. When they reached the Bach chorale, the very piece that had caused the earlier dispute, Ricci glanced briefly toward the Pope. Leo's face remained impassive, but he gave the slightest of nods. The pianist began at the faster tempo he had insisted upon, his fingers dancing across the keys with mathematical precision, and it worked. Even those in the audience with untrained ears could feel the rightness of it, the way the quicker tempo revealed the intricate patterns in Bach's composition. As the piece concluded, spontaneous applause broke out, interrupting the program momentarily. Throughout it all, Pope Leo maintained his dignified silence, neither approving nor disapproving, simply present and attentive. The concert continued without incident, each piece receiving enthusiastic response from the audience. The live-stream chat visible to the technical team backstage showed viewers from around the world expressing awe at both the musical quality and the remarkable atmosphere given the circumstances. As the final notes of the last piece faded away, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Ricci bowed deeply, then gestured to the choir and Sister Elena, who received their own wave of applause. Protocol dictated that the Pope would now come to the stage to thank the performers and make a brief speech about the charitable cause. Cardinal Rossi moved to escort Leo from his seat, but the Pope was already standing, making his way to the steps at the side of the stage. Ricci tensed visibly as the pontiff approached. This would be the moment of public reckoning. Would the Pope use this platform to put him in his place? To make some subtle but pointed comment about musical interpretation? Pope Leo reached the center of the stage, smiling warmly at the audience as the applause continued. When it finally quieted, he spoke with clear, measured words. Music has been called the language of the soul. Tonight we have been blessed to hear that language spoken with exceptional eloquence. He turned slightly toward Ricci and the choir. I thank our magnificent performers for sharing their gifts with us and with the world. Not a word about the controversy. Not a hint of wounded pride or desire for vindication. The Pope continued, speaking passionately about the refugee children who would benefit from the evening's donations, describing their needs and hopes with such vivid detail that many in the audience were moved to tears. As Leo spoke, Ricci studied him with growing confusion and something like admiration. The Pope's restraint was unlike anything he had encountered in his career. In the cutthroat world of classical music, slights were remembered and grudges carefully nursed. Yet here was a man who seemed genuinely capable of setting aside personal offense for a greater purpose. When the speech concluded, the Pope turned to shake Ricci's hand. Cameras captured the moment, broadcasting it to millions. Their eyes met briefly, and Ricci found himself unable to read what lay behind the Pope's gaze. Not anger, certainly, but something more complex. Thank you, Maestro, Leo said simply, his voice too low for the microphones to catch. Your Holiness, Ricci began, but the Pope had already moved on to thank Sister Elena and the choir, leaving the pianist with the words unspoken. The reception afterward was held in one of the Vatican's elegant halls. Guests mingled, discussing the concert and making additional donations to the cause. Early reports indicated that the fundraising goal had been surpassed, with online donations still pouring in from around the world. Ricci stood somewhat apart from the crowd, a glass of water in his hand. He had received congratulations from numerous attendees, though he noticed that some kept a polite distance. The video of his outburst had done its damage. Father Thomas approached, looking more relaxed now that the event had concluded successfully. The Pope is leaving soon, he said. He asked me to tell you that he appreciates your artistic contribution this evening. Ricci frowned slightly. That's all? He also said that you're welcome to use the piano for practice tomorrow morning if you wish. He understood that today's rehearsal was interrupted. The pianist stared at the young priest. I publicly questioned his musical knowledge. The video has millions of views, and his response is to offer me more time with the piano? Father Thomas smiled. His Holiness has his own way of responding to situations, Maestro. Not what most would expect. Across the room, Pope Leo was saying his goodbyes to various dignitaries. Though he maintained his usual warm demeanor, those who knew him well could detect a slight weariness in his movements. It had been a long day, filled with unexpected challenges. As the Pope reached the exit, he paused and looked back, his eyes finding Ricci in the crowd. For a moment, their gazes locked across the room. Then Leo gave a small nod, not of forgiveness exactly, but of acknowledgement. With that, he departed, leaving Ricci standing alone with his thoughts. Later that night, as the Vatican grounds grew quiet, lights burned in 2 separate windows. In his private study, Pope Leo sat with a cup of tea listening to an old recording of Bach's well-tempered clavier. In his hotel room across the city, Matteo Ricci stared at his phone, watching the continuing online reaction to his comments about the Pope. Both men were thinking about music, about pride, and about the strange dance of public perception, and both were wondering what would happen when they met again, as they inevitably would in 3 days' time. Neither could have predicted the conversation that awaited them, or how it would change them both. 3 days after the concert, Matteo Ricci sat in the lobby of his Rome hotel, staring at his phone. The controversy showed no signs of dying down. While music critics had praised his performance, the court of public opinion had largely turned against him. His social media accounts were flooded with comments ranging from disappointed to outright hostile. His manager had called twice already that morning, discussing the need for a formal public apology. Perhaps a donation to a Catholic charity, his manager had suggested. Something to show goodwill. Ricci had ended the call without committing to anything. It wasn't that he didn't feel remorse, he did, more than he had expected to. But there was something that felt hollow about the standard celebrity apology playbook. Issue a statement, make a donation, wait for the news cycle to move on. The pianist checked his watch. In 1 hour, he was scheduled to depart for the airport, leaving Rome behind. His European tour would continue in Vienna the following evening. Part of him felt relief at the thought of escaping the shadow of the Vatican and focusing purely on music again. His phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Maestro Ricci, this is Cardinal Rossi. His Holiness has requested a meeting with you this morning, if you are available. Please call me at this number. Ricci stared at the message, reading it twice to be sure he understood. The Pope wanted to see him, why? To deliver in private the rebuke he had withheld in public. With slightly unsteady fingers, he dialed the number. Cardinal Rossi speaking. This is Matteo Ricci. I received your message. Ah, Maestro. Thank you for calling promptly. His Holiness would like to meet with you at 11, if that suits your schedule. Ricci hesitated. My flight departs at 2. That should leave ample time. The meeting will be private, just you and the Pope. No media, no staff present beyond the necessary security. May I ask the purpose of this meeting? There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. His Holiness did not specify. He merely expressed a wish to speak with you before you leave Rome. After confirming the details, Ricci hung up and sat motionless for several minutes. Then he called the front desk to arrange for his checkout to be delayed and a later taxi to the airport. At exactly 11 o'clock, Ricci found himself being led through a series of corridors in the Apostolic Palace. The surroundings were grand, yet somehow intimate. Centuries of history in every corner, but scaled to human dimensions. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floors as a young priest guided him toward the Pope's private study. His Holiness is expecting you, the priest said, knocking gently on a wooden door. Enter, came a voice from within. The priest opened the door and stepped aside, allowing Ricci to pass. The pianist took a deep breath and walked in. Pope Leo's study was not what Ricci had expected. Rather than an austere, formal space, it was warm and lived in. Bookshelves lined the walls filled with volumes that showed signs of actual use, not mere decorative objects. A large desk occupied one side of the room, covered with papers, books, and what appeared to be musical scores. Near the window stood a small table with 2 comfortable chairs. The Pope rose from behind his desk, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. Maestro Ricci, thank you for coming on such short notice. Ricci bowed slightly. Your Holiness, I was surprised by your invitation. Please sit. Leo gestured to the table by the window. As they both took seats, the Pope continued, "I imagine you're curious about why I asked to see you. I assumed it was about my inappropriate comments during the rehearsal." The Pope's eyes twinkled slightly. "In part, yes, but not in the way you might think." He reached beside his chair and lifted a leather messenger bag that Ricci hadn't noticed. From it, he pulled several folders and what looked like old notebooks. "Are you familiar with Heinrich Rautmann's analysis of Bach's mathematical structures?" Leo asked, opening one of the folders. Ricci blinked, thrown by the unexpected question. "Of course. His work on the numerical symbolism in Bach's compositions is fundamental, though somewhat controversial in academic circles." "Indeed." The Pope nodded, pleased. "I've always found his approach fascinating, even where I disagree with his conclusions." He pushed the open folder toward Ricci. "This is my own analysis of the very chorale we performed at the concert." Ricci leaned forward, his professional curiosity instantly engaged. The pages contained detailed musical notations, mathematical calculations, and handwritten notes in a neat, precise hand. The work was thorough and showed a deep understanding of Bach's compositional techniques. "You wrote this?" he asked, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. Leo smiled. "I did. Before I entered the seminary, I spent 3 years studying musicology at the conservatory in Milan. Bach was my particular focus." For the next half hour, the Pope guided Ricci through his analysis, pointing out patterns and structures that even the pianist, with all his expertise, had not fully appreciated. They discussed tempos and interpretations, occasionally disagreeing but always with mutual respect, "You see," Leo said, tapping a particular passage. "This is why I initially suggested the slower tempo. If we examine the golden ratio proportions here and here, it suggests a deliberate rhythmic expansion." Ricci studied the notation, frowning slightly. "I see your reasoning, though I still believe the faster tempo better serves the mathematical precision of the counterpoint. And that," the Pope said with a warm smile, "is the beauty of music, is it not? The same notes can speak differently to different souls." He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "Which brings me to why I really asked you here today." The pianist looked up, suddenly remembering the context of their meeting. Not two music scholars discussing Bach, but the head of the Catholic Church and the musician who had publicly belittled him. "Your Holiness, I want to express my sincere regret for—" Leo raised a hand gently. "Maestro, please. This isn't about apologies. In fact, I should thank you." "Thank me." Ricci's confusion was evident. The Pope nodded. "Your candid assessment of my musical understanding created an opportunity, one I've been considering for some time." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at St. Peter's Square below. "Do you know what I miss most from my pre-papal life? Teaching, sharing knowledge, watching understanding bloom in a student's eyes." Turning back to Ricci, he continued, "The Church does remarkable work around the world, but our mission to inspire and educate sometimes gets lost amid dogma and tradition. Music speaks to people in ways that sermons often cannot. I'm not sure I follow, Your Holiness. What if we were to create a series of educational concerts, not formal affairs like the charity event, but workshops where young people, especially those with limited access to musical education, could learn to appreciate classical music?" The Pope's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "We could begin with Bach, exploring how his mathematical structures mirror divine order. You could demonstrate at the piano. I could provide historical and theoretical context." Ricci stared at him. "You want us to collaborate? After what happened?" Leo laughed softly. "Especially after what happened. Think of the story it tells. Two people with different perspectives finding common ground through music." He became more serious. "And think of the children who have never heard Bach, never felt the transformative power of music because they were born into circumstances where survival takes precedence over art." The pianist sat in stunned silence. Of all the scenarios he had imagined for this meeting, this had not been among them. "You're not angry," he said finally, a statement rather than a question. "Anger serves little purpose, Maestro. I found it far more rewarding to look for the opportunity within the challenge." The Pope returned to his seat. "So what do you think of my proposal?" Ricci considered it. His schedule was already packed for the next year. Concerts, recordings, master classes at prestigious institutions. And yet something about this unexpected offer stirred him in a way those obligations did not. It would require significant planning, he said slowly, and I have commitments, of course. I'm not suggesting we begin tomorrow, perhaps in 6 months. We could start with a pilot program here in Rome, then expand if it proves successful. As they continued discussing possibilities, Ricci found himself increasingly drawn to the idea. The Pope's enthusiasm was infectious, and the pianist began to see how his skills could serve a purpose beyond entertaining wealthy audiences in grand concert halls. After nearly 3 hours, far longer than either had anticipated, they had outlined a framework for what they were now calling the Bach Project. It would begin with a series of workshops for children from refugee families in Rome, using music as a bridge between cultures and experiences. I believe we should include Sister Elena and some members of the Vatican choir, Leo suggested. The human voice adds a dimension that even the piano cannot capture alone. Ricci nodded. And perhaps we could create simplified arrangements that the children themselves could learn to play on basic instruments. As they finalized details, a knock came at the door. Cardinal Rossi entered, looking mildly concerned. Your Holiness, I apologize for the interruption, but you have the meeting with the Brazilian ambassador in 15 minutes. Ah, yes. Thank you for reminding me. The Pope turned to Ricci. It seems our time is up for today, Maestro. The pianist checked his watch and was startled to see how much time had passed. My flight, I should go as well. As they stood apart, Leo extended his hand. I look forward to our collaboration, Maestro Ricci. Taking the offered hand, Ricci felt a strange mix of emotions, respect, humility, and something like excitement. As do I, Your Holiness, and thank you. Not many would have responded to criticism with such grace. The Pope smiled. Music teaches us that dissonance can lead to the most beautiful harmonies, if we have the patience to let it resolve naturally. As Cardinal Rossi escorted him out, Ricci felt lighter than he had in days. The controversy would continue, of course. The internet had a long memory. But somehow, that seemed less important now. In the car to the airport, he pulled out his phone and began making notes about the Bach Project. By the time he boarded his flight to Vienna, he had already emailed his manager to clear space in his schedule 6 months ahead. Meanwhile, in the Vatican, Pope Leo XIV sat across from the Brazilian ambassador, discussing diplomatic relations. But a part of his mind was still on Bach, mathematics, and the unexpected alliance born from a moment of public humiliation. Neither man could have predicted where their paths would lead next, or how their musical collaboration would grow into something that would touch thousands of lives around the world. 6 months later, sunshine streamed through the large windows of a renovated hall in one of the Vatican's lesser-known buildings. Once used for storage, the space had been transformed into a warm, inviting music room. Rows of simple chairs faced a small stage where a grand piano gleamed under the lights. On the walls hung framed illustrations explaining basic music theory, alongside quotes about music from philosophers, theologians, and composers throughout history. Matteo Ricci sat at the piano, playing a simplified version of Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. Around him stood 20 children ages 8 to 12, watching his hands with wide-eyed fascination. Some held recorders or small percussion instruments, waiting for their cue to join in. Listen for the pattern, Ricci explained, playing a short phrase. Bach built his music like a master architect. Each piece fits perfectly with the others. From the back of the room, Pope Leo XIV watched with quiet satisfaction. He wore a simple white cassock, without the formal papal regalia, his preferred attire for these sessions. The past 6 months had seen the Bach Project evolve from concept to reality with remarkable speed. The first workshop, held 3 months earlier with just 10 refugee children, had been covered by a single Vatican journalist. Now, in their fourth series of workshops, they had expanded to include children from various backgrounds, refugees, local Roman children from low-income families, and even a few from more privileged homes whose parents had heard about the unique educational opportunity. Sister Elena stood near the Pope, reviewing sheet music for the next activity. They're connecting with the music much faster than we anticipated, she whispered. Leo nodded. Music speaks a universal language. These children may come from different worlds, but Bach reaches them all. At the piano, Ricci was demonstrating how the same melodic line could sound completely different depending on the underlying harmonic structure. The children gasped in delight as the familiar tune transformed from joyful to melancholy with just a few changed notes in the left hand. "Now you try," the pianist said, gesturing to the children with instruments. "Remember what we practiced. Start when I nod." As the children played their simple parts, creating a scaled-down version of Bach's counterpoint, a small crowd of observers at the back of the room exchanged impressed glances. Among them were several music educators from prominent European conservatories, a documentary filmmaker, and representatives from international children's charities. The Bach project had begun to attract attention beyond the initial controversy that had sparked it. What had started as an impromptu idea during that pivotal meeting between the Pope and the pianist had evolved into something neither had fully anticipated. When the children's practice session concluded, they took a break for snacks in an adjoining room, supervised by volunteers. This left the adults time for their own discussion. "The press conference is scheduled for tomorrow morning," Cardinal Rossi informed the group. "We've had inquiries from major outlets across Europe and the Americas." Pope Leo nodded. "Are we prepared for the announcement?" "Everything is in place, Your Holiness," Sister Elena confirmed. "The initial funding is secured, and we have commitments from 15 countries to host workshops in the coming year." Ricci, who had joined them from the piano, looked thoughtful. "It's grown far beyond what we initially discussed." "The best ideas often do," the Pope replied with a warm smile. Their conversation was interrupted by a young boy named Pietro, who had slipped back into the room. He approached Ricci with shy determination. "Maestro," he said in halting Italian that still carried traces of his native Syrian accent, "could you show me again the part with the left hand I want to practice?" Ricci glanced at the Pope, who nodded encouragingly. "Of course," the pianist said, leading the boy back to the piano. As they worked together, the boy's face lit up with each small success. Watching them, Pope Leo felt a profound sense of rightness. This connection, this passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, was what music had always been meant to do. The following morning, the Vatican press room was filled beyond capacity. Journalists from around the world had gathered, drawn by the unusual pairing of the Pope and the famous pianist who had once publicly criticized him. When Pope Leo XIV and Matteo Ricci entered together, a hush fell over the room, followed by the rapid clicking of cameras. They took their seats at the center of a long table, joined by Sister Elena, Cardinal Rossi, and 2 representatives from international education organizations. A Vatican spokesperson opened the proceedings, then turned the microphone over to the Pope. "Thank you all for coming," Leo began, his voice calm and measured. "6 months ago, many of you reported on a moment of musical disagreement between Maestro Ricci and myself. This drew a ripple of knowing laughter from the press corps. What might have remained merely an awkward incident has instead blossomed into something beautiful and meaningful. Today, we are pleased to announce the formal establishment of the International Foundation for Musical Education, growing from our pilot program known as the Bach Project." The Pope explained the Foundation's mission: to bring classical music education to children in underserved communities worldwide, with a special focus on conflict zones and refugee populations. The Vatican would provide initial support and facilities, but the Foundation would operate as an independent, non-denominational organization. "Music transcends religious, cultural, and political boundaries," Leo continued. "It speaks to something universal in the human spirit. We have seen this truth demonstrated powerfully in our work with children over these past months." When it was Ricci's turn to speak, he seemed transformed from the tightly wound perfectionist who had arrived at the Vatican a half-year earlier. His usual intensity remained, but it was now tempered with something like humility. "I have performed on the world's greatest stages," the pianist said, "but none has given me the satisfaction I've found working with these children. They approach Bach without preconceptions, with pure curiosity and joy." He paused, then added with a self-deprecating smile, Some might say they listened more attentively than I did when His Holiness first shared his musical insights with me. This drew genuine laughter from the room, including the Pope himself. As the press conference continued, Ricci and the Pope described their vision for the Foundation's future. There would be a flagship academy in Rome, with satellite programs in cities across 6 continents. Master musicians would volunteer as teachers, recording artists would donate proceeds from special concerts, and an online platform would make basic music education accessible even in remote areas. The questions from journalists eventually turned to the personal aspect of their collaboration. "Your Holiness," asked a reporter from an American network, "many were surprised by your response to Maestro Ricci's comments. Rather than taking offense, you turned a potentially negative situation into something positive. Was this a conscious decision?" Pope Leo considered the question carefully. "In my life, I have found that responding to criticism with openness rather than defensiveness often leads to growth." Maestro Ricci spoke honestly about music, a subject about which he has profound knowledge. While his delivery might have been more diplomatic, he added with a gentle smile toward the pianist, there was truth in his assessment. "And that truth," the reporter pressed. "That I had become somewhat rigid in my musical interpretations," Leo admitted. "Our discussions have reminded me that even in traditions centuries old, there is room for fresh perspective." When it was Ricci's turn to field personal questions, a journalist from a classical music magazine asked what many had been wondering. "Maestro, has working with Pope Leo changed your approach to music or to dealing with other musicians?" Ricci glanced at the Pope before answering. "It has changed everything," he said simply. "I have built my career on technical perfection and uncompromising standards. These remain important, but I've been reminded that music is fundamentally about connection. Between notes, between performers, between the piece and the listener." He continued, his voice growing more passionate. "Working with these children, seeing them light up when they grasp a musical concept for the first time, it has reawakened something I had begun to lose in the pursuit of perfection. His Holiness," he nodded toward Leo, "teaches by example that greatness lies not in being right, but in being willing to listen." The press conference concluded with a brief video showing highlights from the workshops. The footage captured moments of both instruction and joy, children learning to play simple melodies, the Pope explaining the historical context of Bach's compositions, and Ricci demonstrating musical concepts with patient enthusiasm, so different from his usual stage persona. The final clip showed a young girl, a refugee from East Africa who had arrived in Italy just months earlier speaking no Italian, playing a simple Bach melody on a keyboard while beaming with pride. The image faded to the Foundation's new logo and website address. As the lights came up, there was a moment of silence before the applause began. Not the polite, perfunctory applause typical of press events, but something more genuine and heartfelt. Pope Leo and Ricci exchanged a glance of shared understanding. What had begun as a moment of public humiliation had transformed into something neither could have imagined that day in the rehearsal hall. Later, as they walked through the Vatican gardens following the press conference, the Pope asked Ricci a question that had been on his mind. "When you criticized my understanding of Bach that day, did you ever imagine we would end up here?" Ricci laughed softly. "Never. I expected to be banned from the Vatican for life. And now?" The pianist stopped walking and turned to face the pontiff. "Now I understand something I've been missing. Music isn't just about perfect execution or even perfect understanding. It's about what happens when the notes reach someone's ears and heart." Pope Leo smiled. Bach himself said, "The aim and final end of all music should be none other than the glory of God and the refreshment of the soul." "I might leave the first part to you," Ricci replied with a grin, "but the refreshment of the soul that I can work with." As they continued their walk, discussing plans for the Foundation's future, neither man could help reflecting on the strange and wonderful path that had led them here. What the world had seen as a gaffe, a moment of embarrassment captured and amplified by social media, had become the catalyst for something meaningful and lasting. In the months and years that followed, thousands of children would discover the joy of music through their foundation. Some would go on to become musicians themselves, while others would simply carry the experience as a bright memory of beauty in sometimes difficult lives. And whenever someone would ask how the unlikely partnership between the Pope and the pianist began, they would share a knowing smile before telling the story of a tempo disagreement, a viral video, and the surprising places humility and forgiveness can lead.